Government are deluded about selling Royal Mail. It is not going to secure the long-term future of Royal Mail.
We'll be looking at what the sell-off could mean for the Postal Service. Also tonight, the SAS sniper who kept an illegal gun and hundreds of bullets under his bed. He loses his latest legal battle to clear his name.
If I didn't have such a strong family, we'd be broken. We're close. It's financial ruin.
With the greatest respect, you failed. You failed.
BBC bosses get a grilling over multi-million-pound payouts to senior executives.
Oh, he's nicked it. First blood to Australia. It's England's captain.
A little blip in our glorious sporting summer. Australia ripped through the England top order on the opening day of the Ashes.
Tonight on BBC London, 2 people die in a house fire. Others are in hospital after jumping for their lives. And the hospital that's still failing its emergency patients 2 years after being told to improve.
Good evening and welcome to the BBC's News at 6. The Royal Mail is to be privatised and, in what's being described as the biggest employee share scheme for decades, staff will be given a stake in the company. The Business Secretary, Vince Cable, says the move will give Royal Mail a long-term future. But the union representing many employees says the company is now making a profit and the sell-off is unnecessary. Here's our industry correspondent, John Moylan.
It's a key national service which handles 58 million items every day. Now the government has confirmed details of Royal Mail's privatisation, the biggest state sell-off in years.
Mount Pleasant, Britain's largest post office.
For decades it was seen as labour-intensive, antiquated, propped up by taxpayers' cash. But today its profits are soaring on the back of higher prices, the growth of online retailing and tens of thousands of job losses. Successive governments have tried and failed to privatise Royal Mail, but in the Commons the Business Secretary said it would be floated on the stock market, although Labour remain unconvinced.
Now the time has come for government to step back from Royal Mail, allow its management to focus wholeheartedly on growing the business and planning for the future. It's now time for employees to hold a stake in the company and share in its success.
So, Mr. Speaker, having nationalised the organisation's debts by taking on its pension liabilities, they now want to privatise the profit at the very time it is making money. How on earth does that make any sense?
The public will be able to buy shares in the business via a special website or through stockbrokers. It's expected to be valued at up to £3 billion. But what will it all mean for Royal Mail's 165,000 workers? Some fear privatisation. This morning union members brought their concerns to the company's central London headquarters. Staff will receive free shares amounting to 10% of the business. It's a possible windfall of up to £2,000.
I don't think our members will be bought off by the free share issues. I mean, look, we're not going to tell people not to take something that's on offer for free. That's not a referendum on whether people think privatisation is the right thing.
The Postal Union is so concerned about privatisation that it's announced its intention to ballot for industrial action. Now that raises the very real prospect of a national strike and Mail at a standstill at the very time when the government is trying to sell off this business.
But what will the sell-off mean for Royal Mail's millions of customers? Should they be worried?
When things are privatised, people just want to make money out of them.
If it's privatised, they'll have to compete and hopefully that'll benefit everybody.
I think consumers will continue to see quite sharp price rises on the price of stamps over the next few years. But they'll also see a private Royal Mail starting to be maybe a little bit less generous with them in terms of the scope of the services that it offers.
Royal Mail also faces challenges in this brave new world. One rival, TNT, has 1,000 postmen on the streets of London and hopes to have up to 20,000 around the UK in 5 years' time. John Moylan, BBC News.
And our business editor, Robert Peston, is with me. Robert, governments have tried to do this before. Why is this time going to be different?
Well, a number of preconditions essential for a successful privatisation have come together. Parliament has already voted for privatisation. It can't be stopped politically. The most politically contentious, sensitive of the assets, the post offices themselves with their important community role, well, they've been taken out and they'll remain in the public sector. And probably most importantly of all, the business has been turned round over the past 3 years from pretty big losses to not enormous profits, but reasonable profits. And most people think there is more profit growth to come because costs have been cut, there's been a lot of investment, and relevantly, Royal Mail has grabbed a big chunk of the fast-growing internet retailing parcels delivery service. But not everything has gone the company's way. As John Moylan pointed out, the CWU union, which represents a staggering 100,000 of Royal Mail's employees, is against the privatisation. And as John said, there is the risk, the prospect of industrial action around the time of the sale. Now, that wouldn't make privatisation impossible, but it does mean that investors would pay less for the shares and taxpayers would get smaller proceeds.
Robert, thanks very much. Thank you. A military court has found an SAS sniper guilty of illegally keeping a pistol and hundreds of bullets in his flat. Sergeant Danny Nightingale originally told police the gun and ammunition were present from his tour of duty in Iraq, but he later claimed he'd made a false confession because of a brain injury. Duncan Kennedy's report does contain some flash photography.
He's fought in dangerous battles for the SAS all over the world, but today Sergeant Danny Nightingale's legal fight to clear his name ended in defeat. An experience he summed up in one word.
Shocking. If I didn't have such a strong family, we'd be broken. We're close. It's financial ruin, but I'm very lucky. I've got Sal, who's been amazing throughout, Dad, the rest of the family. So yeah.
His wife Sally maintained he'd done nothing wrong and thanked the public for its support.
I say thanks for their support. I say continue to support us because he isn't guilty and he's not a criminal.
This was the Glock pistol the court decided Danny Nightingale owned, an unauthorised war trophy. In police interviews, he confessed to bringing it back into Britain, breaking all military rules, even for the SAS.
It came back. It was intended to be decommissioned. It's something I've never got round to, which in my line I appreciate. It is very naive and it's something I should have done but haven't yet.
In court, he claimed this was a false confession, brought on because of severe brain damage he suffered during a charity run in the Amazon forest. His case generated huge support from the public. In their view, a veteran SAS soldier unfairly prosecuted for possessing a war trophy. Tonight, his campaign team say despite the guilty verdicts, that support will continue.
I very much hope that the court will take account in sentencing of the fact that this man was severely brain damaged on a charity run in Brazil and has given so much service to the country.
A spokesman for the military tonight said that Danny Nightingale had received the retrial that he was looking for and that any sentence would be down to the military jury that had tried him. But it added that that jury should take account of the fact that he's a fine soldier. It's not often that the words SAS soldier and defeat share the same sentence. But Danny Nightingale's military career is now at an end because he broke one of the rules of war. Duncan Kennedy, BBC News in Bulford.
David Cameron and Ed Miliband could barely be heard during a clash over party funding at Prime Minister's Questions today. As MPs on both sides shouted, Mr Cameron told the Labour leader he was owned by the unions, while Mr Miliband said the Tories were owned by a few millionaires. Here's our Deputy Political Editor, James Landale.
Who should pay for our politics? For days, Labour's been criticised for taking cash from the trade unions, but today Ed Miliband turned his fire on the Conservatives, claiming they'd received millions from city bankers. That, he said, was the difference between the parties.
6p a week in affiliation fees from ordinary people up and down this country against a party funded by a few millionaires at the top. I am willing, as I've said before, to have a £5,000 limit on donations from trade unions, businesses and individuals. Is he willing to do that?
No, the Prime Minister said. He'd support a cap, but not one set so low.
It would imply a massive amount of taxpayer support for political parties. And frankly, Mr. Speaker, I don't see why the result of a trade union scandal should be every taxpayer in the country paying for Labour.
Here's the difference between him and me. I want party funding reform, he doesn't. I'm proud that we have links with ordinary working people. He's bankrolled by a few millionaires. The party of the people, the party of privilege.
But Labour, the Prime Minister said, was still the party of the unions.
Will the unions still have the biggest vote at the conference? Yes. Will they still be able to determine the party's policy? Yes. Will they still have the decisive vote in voting for the Labour leader? Yes. That is the fact. They own you, lock, stock and block vote.
Over the last year, the Tories received £13 million, more than £1 million from one city banker alone. Labour got more than £12 million, 2/3 from the unions. The Lib Dems, £2.7 million. The parties say they want to stop relying on rich unions and individuals, but can't agree on how much donations should be capped, who should be covered by that cap, and how much taxpayers should contribute. But today, one of the most powerful union leaders in Britain said Mr Miliband's proposed reforms would mean Labour getting millions less from them each year and potentially ending the union's historic affiliation to the party.
Ed's decided this is the way he wants to go. I think it is an absolute landmark move. It's a, I think in terms of, he said he wanted to mend the link, not end it. But I think, frankly, this is as close as we're going to get to ending it.
The unions and the parties have been fighting for years over how to fund politics, but it's politics that always gets in the way of a deal. If today's exchanges are anything to go by, don't expect agreement soon. James Landau, BBC News, Westminster.
Firefighters could go on strike this summer in a dispute over changes to pensions. The Fire Brigades Union has announced it will ballot members about a possible walkout. The FBU represents over 85% of the uniformed staff of the UK Fire and Rescue Service. 60 people are now thought to be dead or missing after a freight train carrying crude oil blew up in Canada. The explosion happened on Saturday after the driverless train rolled downhill into the town of Lac Megantic and derailed. The authorities have launched a criminal investigation, but they have ruled out terrorism. Healthcare assistants look after some of the most needy and vulnerable people in society, but often have little, if any, training. Now, a report commissioned by the government after the Stafford Hospital scandal has recommended that all staff in England should receive a minimum standard of training. Here's our health correspondent, Sophie Hutchinson.
It was the scandal of hundreds of unnecessary deaths following neglect and abuse at Mid Staffordshire Hospital that prompted today's review of healthcare assistants. A vast army of more than 1 million work across the UK in our homes, care homes and hospitals, looking after some of the most vulnerable patients' basic and essential needs.
Some of them are doing jobs that were never envisaged 20 years ago. They're doing jobs that used to be done by nurses, even doctors.
The independent review has recommended that healthcare assistants in England undertake basic training in first aid, infection control and dementia care, that there should be a certificate for those who reach the required standard, and that they should be renamed nursing assistants to reduce confusion.
Hi Edith, are you all right?
Some healthcare assistants have been trained by their employers and pride themselves on their expertise, but unions have welcomed the idea of having one training scheme for everyone as a way of tackling patchy care.
Someone who's handed a DVD said, go away and look at this short DVD, and the next day you're going to be out in people's homes delivering care to them. Now that's clearly unacceptable, and I expect the public don't even think that's what's happening. People trust the care staff who come into their home, but in actual fact many of them have had almost no training.
Healthcare assistants working at hospitals like this carry out some of the most intimate and personal care, washing patients and turning them over in their beds. But unlike the doctors and nurses around them, they're not regulated. They can't be struck off for misconduct. And some say that simply isn't good enough.
You've got to actually have regulation, like doctors and nurses, and indeed other professions are, so that if you step out of line or you're shown to be unsafe, then you're jolly well dealt with quickly so that no further lives are lost.
We'll tuck you in, then you're not hot.
The government says it will respond to today's report in the autumn, but ministers insist that regulating healthcare assistants would be a bureaucratic nightmare and isn't necessary in keeping vulnerable people safe. Sophie Hutchinson, BBC News.
MPs have accused managers at the BBC of presiding over corporate fraud and cronyism. Senior BBC bosses faced a grilling today over the millions paid out to senior executives who left the corporation. It follows a report which showed that in some cases staff received more than they were entitled to. Our media correspondent David Sillito reports.
The BBC's been slimming down, getting rid of managers, but it's also been paying a lot of money to get rid of them. Today, the trust that oversees the BBC faced MPs, and from the outset, they made their feelings clear about those payments.
It was a question of shock and dismay for us to discover how many had been beyond contractual and therefore had been even higher than they needed to be.
It's not just the size of the payments that alarmed MPs, it's the fact that the BBC was paying more than it needed to. Did the BBC Trust know this was going on? The answer was no. And then came the next question from the chair of the Public Accounts Committee.
Should the Trust have known?
Yes, and if you call in due course a previous Director General of the BBC, I will be as interested as you are in why we didn't know.
The man he was pointing the finger at is the former Director General Mark Thompson, seen here in the middle. On 2 occasions he was said to have made assurances that certain payments were what the BBC had to pay. The facts now suggest, in the Trust's words, some disconnect. He'll face questions in November. In its defence, the BBC said redundancies were saving the corporation £19 million a year, but admitted they could have saved more.
You know, it's a licence fee, there's money. It's not your money. It's our money.
I understand that, Madam Chairman, and I accept, as the BBC has accepted, many of the criticisms that were within the NAO report, that too often we were too generous.
£949,000 for Mark Byford, the former Deputy Director General, £486,000 for the former Director General George Entwistle, and Rowley Keating, a former controller, who has now paid back his £376,000 redundancy. After 2 hours of cross-examination, the BBC's discomfort was plain to see. It's now introducing a cap of £150,000 on payoffs, hoping to end a matter on which it admits it had lost its way. David Sillito, BBC News.
And the time is 18 minutes past 6. Our top story this evening. The biggest privatisation in 30 years. The government gives the green light for the Royal Mail to be sold off. And still to come, a bad start for England in their defence of the Ashes.
Later on BBC London News, it houses the capital's underage criminals, but inspectors say Feltham has unacceptably high levels of violence. And we catch up with the young athlete chosen as a star of the future in the Olympics opening ceremony.
Now, who should have the right to fish in the waters off England? Each year, fishing crews are given a quota limiting their catch. That's done to protect fish numbers. But is the system fair? Crews using boats under 10 metres long make up 76% of the fishing fleet. But they get just 4% of the quotas. Today, after a High Court ruling, that's set to change. Roger Harrabin is in Hastings and joins me now. Roger.
Yes, George, the sun is really shining on the small fishermen tonight. They've been having a really hard time of it recently. Take a look here on the beach in Hastings. Behind me, you see maybe about 20 boats. Well, a few years ago, that number would probably have been 40. And the rest have been driven out of business, largely by the quota system.
It's a hard life, fishing. This boat returned with its catch just after dawn.
David White has been out in the English Channel 10 nights in a row to make the most of the good weather. All fishermen in Europe are given a quota. That's the total amount they're allowed to catch in any one year. David's been catching sole. But like many small fishermen, the quota he's allocated is barely enough to make a living.
Oh, it's getting harder and harder. It's getting ridiculous, to be honest with you. I mean, we've worked 10 trips now on the trot, 10 days worth of day off, just to make ends meet.
Big firms gobble up about 90% of the national quota. The government agreed recently to take £1.4 million worth of quota away from the big boats and give it to the small boats. But the big firms challenged the decision in court. The judge rejected that challenge, so quotas for the little guys will go up.
Well, I think it's bloody marvellous, absolutely unbelievable. I didn't think for 1 minute that we would get the verdict. We was up against, you know, great opposition with lots of money, and we're just little boys, just, you know, earning a scratch and a living.
It's the big industrial fishing fleets that catch the great majority of the fish we eat. The big firms believe the government has no right to remove any of its quota.
We have considered an appeal. That will be considered fully by the members of the UK Association, and we may be returning to the High Court in the autumn.
In Hastings, the court decision today is really important. Small fishing boats are part of the very soul of seaside towns like this. Today's decision comes just a few weeks after a huge decision by the European Union to end the practice of overfishing, which has pillaged Europe's seas. Now, if that decision and today's are put fully into practice, it greatly increases the chances, George, of you, me and all the rest of us being able to go to a seaside town in future and enjoy for our supper freshly caught local fish. And that has to be a good thing.
Roger, thanks very much. Thank you. Police say the deaths of up to 17 people in Scotland and Northern Ireland may be linked to fake ecstasy tablets. They've warned users they risk playing Russian roulette with their lives. The latest victim died yesterday, as our correspondent James Cook reports.
They're not ecstasy, they are deadly. Tablets like these may have killed up to 10 young people in Northern Ireland and 7 in Scotland. The latest victim was an 18-year-old woman in Dumbartonshire who died yesterday. How worried are you about the deaths that we've seen?
Well, I mean, I think that we're sufficiently worried to make this appeal and to warn people about the dangers, because...
And that warning is dire.
They're made in backstreet laboratories by people who don't care what effect they have on you. The dealers and the people manufacturing them don't care. So you're playing Russian roulette with your life. You don't know what's in the tablet. You don't know what effect it's going to have on you. Don't take it.
Doctors do know what's in the tablets, a toxic substance called PMA. It causes aching muscles, frightening hallucinations, and worse.
They become combative, quite aggressive, and they're confused as about the surroundings and who's actually trying to help them. Then what happens is their body temperature starts to rise quite dramatically, and it is that which is what is killing these individuals.
The fact that the deaths here are being linked not to pure ecstasy but to fake ecstasy has prompted a debate about whether it would be safer to regulate the drug. Most clubbers who take ecstasy think the main ingredient they're buying is MDMA, but of course they can't know for sure.
A policy of blanket prohibition has driven everything underground, whereas a regulated market would be able to guarantee what it is that people were buying and what the effects were, and the person who was making that choice would get what they paid money for.
For now, police are worried about this weekend's Tea in the Park festival. Extra doctors are being sent amid worries that heat, alcohol and drugs could be a deadly mix. James Cook, BBC News, Glasgow.